clear to me that the Chinese understood that they had to break into a global system dominated by the American empire, and that's a very real problem. They couldn't expect to do it with their Marxist ideology. They couldn't expect to do it with the fact that they are a big country population-wise. They couldn't do it that they were politically in some way a relevant, exciting option. A little of that, but they knew they had to make an economic issue. In that way, they copied from the United States. The United States took the economic catastrophe of World War II and said to the world, we came through it without a catastrophe. We will now help you recover. We will buy your products. We will lend you tons of money. We will make the world safe for ships to move around. We'll hold back the nasty Soviets so they can't interfere with you. We're the economic core, and so you better be respectful of our politics, our ideology. And so everybody in the world decided that denim was the right material for your pants. That was the United States' power in that situation. The Chinese figured we have to do something economically if we want to prevail the United States, given its military and political dominance, and the fact that it will be hostile because the revolution of 1949 was achieved by a communist and a communist party operating its own eighth root army that did the work and defeated our little man there, Chiang Kai-shek, forcing him to take his bedraggled elite off to Taiwan and try to make a life there, and we've seen how that's evolved. So I think you're right, the Belt and Road did that, and it did it exactly the way the United States did it. It taught everybody, you want the help of the Chinese. The Chinese are now a powerhouse economically. The way I explain it to my students is I say every third world government, what we used to call the third world, Asia, Africa, Latin America, so on, when they need to have a railroad built or a port built or a health system funded or a university system grounded, they used to go to Washington or London or Paris and present their project and hope for help. But instead of coming home after they go there, they go to Beijing or New Delhi or Sao Paulo, Brazil, and they present the same project, and then they do what now can be done. They play the two against each other. That's what you and I would do if we were Paraguayans looking for help, or Nigerians, right, or Malaysians. But here's the problem. If you add up the GDP of China and the BRICS, it's about 35% of global GDP. If you add up the United States and the G7, it's about 29% of global GDP. If you wanted a single statistic that captures what has happened to the global economy, I just gave it to you. That's why I say, partly to be provocative, but also to be accurate, the competition is largely over. They've passed the milestones. Now the question is, what are the Chinese going to do with the situation, the position they've accomplished? And what is the United States going to do with the position the Chinese have accomplished? And what you're watching is the early phase of the United States. It pretended for much of the last 25 years that what was going on in China wasn't happening. I cannot tell you how many conferences I attended, how many seminars. I was often a participant, a panelist, and I heard and listened to politely my colleagues explaining to the audience that the statistics coming out from China were not true, that this was communist propaganda or statistical manipulation, or on and on. And I have to admit, when I first heard it, I wondered, well, I'm aware that statistics can be manipulated. It happens in this country. It certainly can happen in China. Why not? But, as the years passed and as my colleagues went to China and came back with their photographs of everything that had amazed them, I began to learn that in fact the statistics weren't far off. So here's another thing they're not doing. They used to say, when they had to face that it was impressive, that the only reason it was impressive was because of the opening to private capitalism. That at a certain point, the Chinese leadership welcomed private capitalist enterprises run both by Chinese citizens, but also by Europeans, Americans, Japanese, anybody who wanted to come. Now, it is true that the Chinese leadership did that. It is true the economy is about a 50-50 split between government-owned and operated enterprises on the one hand, and privately owned and operated. They have a stock market, they have billionaires, they have the apparatus of private capitalism. And did that participate in their achievement? Absolutely. So did the Communist Party, that is the supervisory apparatus coordinating. When my students raise their hand and say, what does coordinating mean? I could tell them it'd take me a semester to take you through it. But here's a summary. The Communist Party says, if the private sector can take care of this activity, then we are happy. You go do it. And if you can make a fortune when you do it, you can keep your fortune. You can be Jack Ma. You can amass enormous personal wealth and quite a bit of personal power. But if you can't do it, then we're going to have it done by the government. Now, the modern China we have is the product of all of that. What their genius is the combination and making it work that well. Here in the United States, by contrast, everything depends on whether it's privately profitable. Even the ideology governing the United States says it doesn't want it done, even if the private profit calculation makes it not happen. The government shouldn't. It's considered a value of the society not to have the government step in. So, do we have a modern railroad system? No. The privates don't want to spend the money, and the public won't step in. So we don't have it. That's all. I live and work in the most developed rail corridor in the country. It's the one that runs from Boston in the north to Washington, D.C. in the mid-Atlantic. Our trains break down. I can't be sure when I step in the train for an hour and a half ride whether I'll be there in an hour and a half or until the next day. You know the standard joke on that train among the people who sit on it, which in the many thousands, we are in a third world country. And everybody giggles, even though the joke by now is very old and has been repeated 1,000. But none of those executives can say, okay, the private sector has failed, and so we're going to turn to they can't do that. It's not that these topics aren't important. It's not that we're not aware that they're there. We all are. But it's the agreed social convention to act as if they weren't there. And when you see with your frustration a remark like, Governor, this is for Americans an adorable naughty boy behavior. They kind of know it transgresses, but they're titillated by it. Look how we can transform the country to our north into another state. It's downright exciting because it's such a nice offset to what's happening in most of the rest of the world. If you were about to face a situation where many of the countries to whom you had made loans, granted that the loans were made in order then to pay for the Chinese to come in and build your railroad. The Marshall Plan of the United States, done by China, more or less. You might be wanting to forgive the loan in the way that there are conservative politicians in the United States who like to remind audiences that many European countries never paid back the Marshall Plan loans that were given to them. And then they have to have a liberal explain to them the point of the loan was two things: to enable France, Germany, and so forth to rebuild their shattered economies. And equally important, it was felt that if you didn't do that, the communists inside those countries, and I mean Britain, France, and Germany, the first post-war government in France, Americans don't know the history, the first post-war government under General de Gaulle who was their great leader, included several cabinet positions held by the Communist Party of France, because they had been the backbone of the anti-Nazi resistance, and nobody could have stopped them anyway. I mean, they came that close to revolution. It did in Italy also. And they could have destabilized Western Germany easily. So the question had to be, well, we don't care whether you ever repay the loan. Here's money for jobs. Here's the equipment to give people the means to rebuild. And you, the non-communist, you will be in charge. You will get the money and you will hire the work and you will rebuild your country as an ally of the United States. Okay, I understand that. I saw the process myself, part of my life, but the Chinese are doing that too, and I can see, but if they have a problem explaining all this to their own people, then maybe they want to keep the whole details under wraps for a while until it's a sort of done deal, and then return, like the way you put it, in a good year to go back to the data. Or maybe they've had a slowdown in their economic growth and they don't want that to be noticed. They don't want to show Mr. Trump that his tariff war is hurting them. Could they motivate this sort of thing? Absolutely. It is very easy to fool around with statistics in ways that really only the statisticians know. Every statistic starts with a question being asked to somebody. A corporate executive, a government official, you ask, how many acres did you farm this year? How many bushels of corn did you get? Well, to imagine that the answer that comes out of that farmer's mouth is always a question of getting it right is just naive. That farmer knows that that information is very interesting to his banker. He knows it's very interesting to the owner of the land. If he's an honest person, he knows he's doing that. If he's a bit of a fudger, then he doesn't want to talk about that. He just wants to do it because he knows that his loans could be in trouble. Okay, we then, as statisticians, we try to filter. We make adjustments. We shave the number, that not necessarily with some evil intent, but trying to make sense of what is always fudgy. So when you see the beautiful table in the government document that you can photocopy or nowadays use electronically and put it in your article, look at it. If you're honest, you'll always hedge it about with what the reader of your report will find frustrating. Caveats, ways in which you're saying it could be read this way, but it could also be. That's actually honest. When you get the straight out, here it is, this proves it, you're dealing with a person who should know better and who's either a dishonest person or a person who hasn't learned the skill of this business very well, because statistics never prove anything. They validate a perspective. That's different. I've been at countless panels where there's a debate about these numbers, that we have half a dozen inflation numbers. Which ones do we use? What does that teach us? And it's a constant debate. It's not as though that debate has ever been resolved. People come to each year with as much passion for or against this number versus that one, what the the Bureau of Labor Statistics puts out on the one hand versus the Fed numbers on the other. And they're partisans for reasons. We sit there and we see the logic of what, but we're often left in the kind of a limbo. Qualitative evidence is every bit as important as quantitative evidence ever was. We need the poets, we need the troubadours, we need the painters, we need the rock stars, because in that song can be a better grasp of what's going on than the table from the Bureau of Labor Statistics will ever do. It's an important corrective.